The slave quarters smelled of damp cotton, sweat, and the iron tang of coins counted in the same breath as names. At the edge of the yard, an open ledger lay on a cracked crate, pages scored with columns that did not list only bales and tools. There were entries that read like invoices, a name, an age, a note, and a number. To walk past that ledger at dusk was to see how private violences had been folded into public accounts. At first, it seemed like a grotesque bookkeeping error. Then the patterns emerged. The cruelty was not random. It had codes, prices, and signatures. To understand how sexual violence became part of an economic architecture of bondage, we must rewind and look at the moment when a smiling philanthropist became the architect of a system that priced dignity. If you value deep historical work that uses documents and testimony to uncover what has been hidden, like and subscribe now to keep these investigations coming. He was introduced in town as a man of progress. Harlan Whitby made donations to the school, paid for a new gate for the church, and gave speeches about labor and discipline that sounded modern and efficient. In public, he wore a crisp coat and an easy smile. On market days, he moved among merchants, praised the stewards of commerce, and accepted the deference offered by local officials. There were songs about his fairness and a flaxen portrait in the county hall that captured that smile. Behind closed gates, however, the account books told a different story. A ledger clerk named Elias noted the first troubling entries with pencil marks and margin comments. At first, they were described as bonuses or special provisions. Soon, they were formalized as fees. What began as a private appetite became a regulated practice, complete with codes, approvals, and receipts. He wrote memos that read like policy, and in the margins, he instructed the overseer Joshua to keep track of outcomes. The face of benevolence hid a system being built. The rise of Whitby Manor was made possible by several people who would be central to the system. There was Joshua Kent, the overseer, whose voice could quiet a cotton field. There was Dr. Beckett, the physician, who provided attestations and medical language to justify measurements of fertility and health. There was Turner, the trader, who handled sales and transfers with an efficiency bordering on indifference. There was Reverend Cole, who offered moral cover in sermons that praised order and submission. There was Auntie Nia, the matriarch among the enslaved, who kept names and stories alive when official ledgers tried to forget. There was Mariah, a young mother whose pleas would one day expose a code, and Ruth, whose quiet ledger notes became one of the few surviving traces of resistance. These characters move through the archive and the yard, sometimes complicit, sometimes constrained, often both. Early scenes of courtship and public works masked the initial normalcy. He fixed the granary roof, he hosted harvest suppers, he hired a scribe to keep clearer records. In interviews with neighbors, he was remembered as pragmatic. The first formalized practice was presented as administrative order. A short memorandum titled Domestics and Allowances appeared, setting stipends for seamstresses and field hands. Within months, that bureaucratic language extended to bodies. The first form of violence made official was sexual access framed as entitlement. A clause in a personnel memorandum, worded as a requirement for maintenance of household order, insisted that certain women be available for oversight. The ledger reflected transfers for clothing and linens after those entries. To the townsfolk who read only the headlines, these were domestic regulations. To the women in the yard, they were commands written into their days. This transformation had a turning point. One autumn, a fever swept the region, and Whitby fell ill. The illness left him altered not only in health but in temperament. He emerged from convalescence with an obsession for measurement and control. He insisted on charts of productivity, schedules of sleep and labor, and, most tellingly, on records of reproductive events. Dr. Beckett, whose ledger of diagnoses had once read like a list of prescriptions, now wrote assessments that turned bodies into data points. He measured months, took notes on cycles, and recommended policies that treated fertility as resource management. In a meeting recorded in a surviving minute, Whitby said that the stability of the estate depended on predictable generations. That sentence, at once clinical and chilling, was the seed of formalized sexual violence. It converted desire and force into a policy problem and then into a ledger item. Seen at the great house parlor, a main scene where orders became rules, voices were low but urgent, and 5 exchanges unfolded before the room fell into an uneasy silence. Joshua said, "I need a list of names by Friday." Elias replied, "Which names, sir? The household or the field?" Joshua said, "Both. The master wants a register for breeding and for bed assignments." Elias said, "There is no code for that in the county guidelines." The master said, "Then create one and mark it official." In that moment, the decision to bureaucratize sexual control was spoken out loud and given a procedure. The air smelled of tobacco and polished wood. A lamp trembled, and a sheet of paper was slid across the table with a pen that left a smear of ink. The tones in the room were domestic, yet the content was administrative. The voice of the man who had once fixed the granary roof now read clauses that would determine who could keep their children and who would have none. What followed was not a single method, but a constellation of practices. We can name 5 distinct forms of sexual violence that were documented and normalized across plantations like Whitby Manor. First, coerced sexual access by owners and overseers, where consent could not exist given the power imbalance. This was seldom called rape in official papers. It was referred to as requisition, duty, or inspection. Second, forced breeding, where women were pressured, scheduled, or coerced to bear children to increase the owner's property. Medical language was used to appraise fertility as asset. Third, sexual violence at auctions and transfers, where bodies were inspected and treated as factors affecting price. Fourth, sexualized punishment and public humiliation, where discipline assumed intimate forms meant to intimidate entire communities. Fifth, medicalized exploitation, where doctors performed examinations or treatments under pretexts that masked abuse, with notes filed as clinical findings. Each of these forms was not isolated. They overlapped, reinforced each other, and were reinforced by ledgers, decrees, and sermons. Descriptions of these practices exist in files, but their texture is found in small things. The taste of sour cornbread eaten by a woman moved at dawn, the press of hard hands as she rose from the bunk, the rustle of a dress returned with unfamiliar stains, the hush after a sudden knock, the distant sound of horses leaving for market, with a child's cry muffled under a blanket. These senses connect the archive to bodies. They also show how official language displaces human suffering. A note about extra rations for new infants can mask the calculus used to produce those infants. A doctor's signature can lend legitimacy to protocols that are essentially instruments of control. The instruments of governance are not only law books and ledgers. They are also nails, sheets, scents, and sounds that mark everyday life. In quieter corners, resistance and solidarity emerged. Auntie Naya taught young mothers to mark the undersides of their sewing kits with symbols that meant safe houses. Mariah wrote the names of children on strips of cloth and hid them in chimneys. Ruth kept a diary in code, which she passed to a visiting seamstress. There were conversations between the enslaved people where murmurs of escape were mixed with plans to record evidence. Dialogue in a back room captured urgency and tenderness. Mariah whispered, "They took my baby's name to the ledger." Ruth replied, "Take your name back on the cloth." Mariah said, "How can a name help?" Ruth answered, "Paper becomes proof if someone sees it." Mariah said, "Who will believe us?" Ruth replied, "We will make them count what they wrote." These exchanges were acts of strategy. They are a reminder that resilience is often bureaucratic as well as brave. But the system attracted collaborators. Reverend Cole provided sermons that softened public perception by moralizing obedience. Turner the trader coordinated shipments, anonymizing transfers through middle agents. Dr. Beckett wrote notes that stripped personal agency from bodies by calling them specimens. Over time, these practices became routinized. The ledger contained codes that would be scanned by clerks, approved by a steward, and archived in the manor safe. A newly created position, a registrar of domestic affairs, formalized procedures and issued certificates. The effect was to render intimate violence legitimate by administrative normalization. Once a practice has a code and a stamp, it gains a bureaucratic life of its own. Tension rose as secrets accumulated. Moment of tension 1. It is night in the yard. Rain hits the tin roofs in a sharp rhythm. Boots slap in the mud, and whispers crack the dark. A small group gathers near the chimneys to read the hidden cloths. Someone coughs, a child's breath pauses, and a dog barks in the distance. The ledger, carried in a satchel, is passed hand to hand, pages turned with trembling fingers. Names unspool like new sentences on paper. One cough is taken as signal. That coughing summons courage, and the small band moves toward the overseer's house with the ledger as accusation. The air is cold, and each breath becomes visible. This is the moment when private record becomes weapon. Moment of tension 2. The market opens and the auctioneer's voice splits the square. A woman is placed on the block, her face set, her hands folded. The crowd murmurs about lineage and price. Turner moves through the throng, his ledger tucked like a secret. The smell of wet straw and horse sweat perfumes the auction. Someone in the crowd recognizes a mark sewn into a hem and realizes the cloth has a name the register lists. The recognition spreads like a flame. A murmur becomes a shout, and the auction stalls. Eyes lock between bidders and the man in charge. For a second, the economy that had seemed unstoppable shows a seam. And that seam is a place where naming can undo the masquerade. Moment of tension 3. A conspiracy of those within the house and those in the fields decides to confront Whitby. In a small parlor, candles gutter. Faces are illuminated in amber. Reverend Cole has been approached by his own conscience and refuses to defend the ledger. Dr. Beckett trembles and offers a signature to retract a most damning note. Joshua, the overseer, feels his authority erode as domestic servants refuse to carry orders. The conspirators do not seek blood. They seek witnesses, signatures, and the ledger itself. Their movements are careful. They speak in clipped sentences. They exchange lists. The moment stretches until the leader of the conspiracy takes the ledger and reads aloud entries that cannot be unseen. The sound of paper becomes accusation. The man who once smiled finds himself exposed to the weight of his own documentation. Confrontation leads to a public rupture. Accusations are read, some officials look away, some clamp down. The owner's reaction is legalistic at first. He issues a decree that frames certain practices as necessary for order. He calls for registrars to continue the work. But the ledger that was meant to conceal becomes evidence because more people now know where to look. A trial is improvised, and testimony from the yard, from hidden cloths and coded diaries begins to unspool a reality that official sermons had masked for years. Some complicit officials are indicted, others quietly reassigned. The man who believed he could translate appetite into policy is weakened, his portrait taken down from the county hall, his name cleansed from the donation plaque. The aftermath does not erase what was done. There is an epilogue that follows survivors, institutions, and records through time. 1 month later, a provisional commission is formed, and the registrar office is sealed. Auntie Nia and Mariah are brought into a room with a table, and for the first time a clerk reads the ledger aloud. Names are cross-referenced with baptismal records and market manifests. Some officials attempt to redact entire pages and claim clerical errors. Others are compelled by witnesses to acknowledge entries. Reparations are suggested, small and halting, and some children are returned to mothers whose names had been struck. In the yard, there is a cautious daylight, and conversations that had been hushed begin to find voice. Yet many who testified face threats, and certain figures like Turner disappear into other networks of trade that resist the commission's reach. 3 months later, reforms are proposed. The county assembles a panel of physicians, clergy, and elders, and issues a codified set of changes intended to prevent the formalization of sexual entitlements. Dr. Beckett is publicly censured and removed from official registries.
Reverend Cole recants some sermons and offers to support community healing. A new archive is created to house testimonies, with Auntie Nia appointed as an advisor to ensure practices do not erase memory. Public ceremonies attempt to mark a rupture, and a new ledger is opened with an index that lists abuses rather than profits. Yet the economy that once benefited from those practices adapts. New euphemisms appear, new middlemen obscure transactions, and some families that prospered under the old system retain influence. The change is partial and contested. 6 months on, the struggle shifts from courts to memory. Grassroots organizations form to teach reading and writing to those who had been denied literacy so they might read records and guard them. Mariah becomes an organizer, traveling between settlements to collect cloths, diaries, and names. Ruth's coded diary is translated and published in pamphlets circulated quietly among sympathetic towns. Laws are on the books, and a few prosecutions reach verdicts, but many perpetrators walk unpunished. The ledger that once lay on a crate is placed in a county archive with restricted access, yet reproductions circulate in the hands of activists. The work of repair is uneven. Survivors find small measures of restitution, some permanent, some symbolic. Children reclaimed learn new names. Families try to rebuild in the shadow of a system that turned bodies into assets. The legacy is complex. Institutions survive by adapting. Where one ledger is closed, another opens, sometimes under a different name. Manuals originally written to instruct household managers become part of administrative textbooks. The language of entitlement evolves, taking new bureaucratic forms. That is the bitter lesson. It is easier to strike a man from a plaque than to dismantle the structures that allowed him to write
His appetites into policy. Memory matters. Records matter. So does vigilance. The ledger remains the emblem and the evidence. If this investigation opened a window into how systems can codify private violence into public procedure, then the work continues. Subscribe to support more episodes in which we follow the paper trails, name actors, and lift the stories of those who were counted instead of being counted on. The ledger can be a tool for accountability or a blueprint for abuse. Which it becomes depends on who keeps watch.